Greetings, friends and family. We're back for another installment in our study in the Word. We are in Romans chapter 4. We're going to read verses 11 and 12. This is kind of a continuation of this paragraph. We covered verses 9 through 10 last time, so we're going to read 11 through 12 to finish this paragraph. This thought that Paul the Apostle is conveying to the reader. He says, "And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had, being yet uncircumcised." I know that's a mouthful. There's a lot there, but it's really quite simple. Again, Paul the Apostle is speaking about justification by faith, being made righteous in the sight of God as a result of faith and not as a result of adherence externally to set of rules and regulations, laws and statutes and judgments and all of that stuff. And circumcision in the Jews' mind was the seal or the sign of their involvement in the covenant. In fact, many of them believed that simply because they were circumcised as infants in the Jewish culture and religion of the time, that they were automatically part of God's kingdom, part of his chosen people. And, Paul is refuting the argument of the Judaizers who came in after Paul had preached grace through Jesus Christ, that people needed to be circumcised or they wouldn't be accepted by God. And so that's basically, Paul's refuting that argument, and he used Abraham and David both as examples of the concept or the truth of justification by faith, even though they were under, in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, even before the Old Covenant, like in Abraham's case, even before the Old Covenant had been given through the law of Moses, circumcision was a sign or seal of somebody's involvement in the covenant of God, the Abrahamic covenant, and all of that. But he says, "And he received," this is Abraham, "received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised." So God, seeing this man Abraham, his faith, his trust, his readiness to obey God, accounted righteousness to Abraham long before he had commanded him to be circumcised, him and his household, his son Ishmael and all of his household. And this was, right before the birth of Isaac, the son of promise. God had imputed righteousness to Abraham before the circumcision. And so he said that he being yet uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised. That Abraham, in a sense, is the father of the faith, of all that would believe upon God and his promises, because Abraham acted in obedience to the promises of God long before the sign or the seal that the Jews, remember, the Jews held to the seal or the sign of the covenant in circumcision, and many of them, especially the religious leaders, believed that circumcision was the covenant, not just the sign of it, but it was part of the covenant, that it needed to be done in order for somebody to enter into the promises that God had for his people. And that just wasn't the case. Religion will often impose things on people that God never intended to be imposed. But that's, I guess, another story for another time. that he might be the father of them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. Again, this is the principle, the law, the idea and the notion that the just shall live by faith, that was conveyed in type and shadow through the illustrations of the lives of men, that this principle was true in the Old Testament and the Old Covenant, and not simply just a new idea that came about, at the advent of Jesus Christ, at the beginning of the new covenant. This was something that God had instituted long before the arrival of Jesus Christ. Now, again, people in mass didn't have the covenant of God through the sacrificial system and all of that, but salvation was available to those that would believe in God and his promises. And so, like I said, the people had kind of twisted or perverted what God originally intended, and they made the seal of the covenant as the actual covenant itself. Verse 12, and the father of circumcision to them who are not circumcised, or who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. And so, he's saying here that Abraham is the father of the faith to all who will believe in God's redemption plan. And while it was types and shadows and illustrations and word pictures in the Old Testament pointing to the coming of his son, the Lord Jesus Christ, and his redemptive work at the cross of Calvary, that it was that faith that Abraham was the father of. And so they who walked in the light that they had, who believed what they could, if you will, based on the promises God had given in the Old Covenant, those people were accounted righteous in the sight of God. And because their hope, their faith, their trust, their dependence was upon what God would do to redeem his people. And so that he is the father of the circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision, meaning that this faith is applicable to all, not just the Jews who entered into the covenant through the sign or the seal of the rite of circumcision, but not who, okay, and the father of circumcision, again, this is verse 12, to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham. Well, those steps of faith were simple obedience to what God had revealed. That was the steps of faith Abraham took. When Abraham was initially called by God to leave the land of his nativity, to leave his family behind, and go to a place where God would yet show him. He hadn't even shown him where he was going. He just said, "You're going to go, and I'll show you along the way." Abraham went. He at least partially believed. He was supposed to leave everybody behind, but he waited till his father Terah was dead, and then he took along Lot, his nephew, which turned out to be disastrous. But it was after Abraham fully obeyed that God came to him and gave him the promises that the Jews held to so dearly. And so that those who walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. And so this faith that Abraham expressed in God, the righteousness that God gave to him, was before he had obeyed in terms of the sign and the seal of the covenant that he was going to cut, that God was going to cut with Abraham and give him all these promises. And so, I'm going to stop right there. We're almost out of time. I love you. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate you. And I will catch you later, and we'll pick it up in the next verse. Love you all. Bye.